Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Should we launch this dog into space?
Let's
launch this dog into space.
Welcome to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast, the podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers, because sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. I'm Paddy Boylan. I'm hosting for today, and joining me are my friends, esteemed and
friends and esteemed.
Joining me are my esteemed friends and colleagues, Lord Phoenix Raig.
Oh wow, you remembered my lordship. So few
Of course.
remember to add that. Thank you. Yes, I am Lord Phoenix Rig. I'm the founder of Bentlight Writing, freelance editing house with a focus on authenticity reading and all that. Agented children's author, all that good stuff. And yeah, that's me.
Very good. Good King Matan Elul.
Oh man, I'm the good king. That's so much better than a lord. You know, it's also about my character as a person, not just
different.
my title.
You've got more responsibilities, so I mean, I'd hold off on that.
Let me enjoy my moment. Beside being a good king, I'm also a writer. I mostly write fantasy and horror. You can find my stories online and, of course, in the new Mythic anthology, which we will plug many times. And I'm an English teacher, which is a lot of fun.
Beautiful. Woo. And so Alex Eldridge the Brave.
I'll take it. Yes, my name is Alex. I am a warrior poet. No, I'm a writer. I also let me see. I've contributed to the anthology that we did. I've also released my own anthology, and recently I had something published in the Big Issue, which was a little literary piece. But usually I do, horror and sci-fi. Yeah,
wonderful. And I am hosting for today. I am the Dark Lord Paddy Boylan. I am a technical writer, bid writer, editor, creative writing teacher, and I write fiction. And at the moment, I'm putting more time to writing fiction. I'm trying to write every day, and so far that's
you've been killing that, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It helps that I've got a lot of freelance work at the moment. So, and why am I giving everyone silly titles? Well, if you haven't read the title of the podcast, which makes you a braver person than I, today we're doing a very deep dive into the very long and sparkly rabbit hole that is high fantasy. The subgenre high fantasy. Before we dive in, why don't we go around and see what you fine gentlemen / lords / kings have been reading and watching and playing and doing? Alex, what have you been up to? What's on your menu?
Yeah, I have been reading a book that was actually recommended to me in a podcast of yore by Catherine Jinks. It's a book called New Grub Street. I ordered it, and it is literally about it's a mid 1850s literary fiction novel about writers in London, and it is surprising and disheartening how little has changed. It's all about money. Like, the whole thing is just all about money and how writers can't get enough of it because people don't pay writers very well. It is disturbingly relevant. Like, you would be amazed. But I'm really enjoying that. And then I'm also playing a roguelike called The Gungeon, Enter the Gungeon, which is great.
Yeah, I know Enter the Gungeon. Okay,
really
very
recommend
cool.
it. It's very fun, very silly.
Very nice. Matan, we haven't seen you in a while, man. How's it going, and what have you been reading?
I'm good. I've done something I've mostly haven't done before in my career as a reader, and I took a book I really like and I took a pause. And that book is The Mirror and the Light, which has been phenomenal. I've loved it, but I took a break because
that is Hilary Mantel's third book in the Wolf Hall trilogy.
Yeah, exactly. Two of the books won Man's Booker Prize, I believe. That good. It's really a good series.
Yes, it is.
I just felt like my mental headspace demanded something less grim, and I picked up the Inheritance cycle, Aragon, which I have never read before. I'm gonna butcher the writer's name. I'm sorry, Paulini, Christopher Paulini, perhaps. Aragon. Anyone?
The dragon, like back from middle
Yeah,
school?
the dragon. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And it was turned into a series of films, or one film that kind of
one
flopped.
film that mixed reviews.
It
Didn't
wasn't
go
great.
well, but
It wasn't great.
I just I picked up the book at the bookstore, opened page 1, and it gave me that fresh feeling of innocent high fantasy, like which we're going to speak of more, and I'm really enjoying it. Just something lighter.
Is that a YA series? I always imagined it was.
I mean, I think it
no
is.
judgment.
I don't think, but I just think YA is a genre that has been kind of created a bit after, like late 2010s. More
Yes.
thinking about Hunger Games and that kind of stuff. When he wrote it, I don't think YA was a targetable audience in the same way that it became later.
Right.
With Divergence and all that kind of stuff.
And at the risk of running along, I mean, YA, if it's good, it's still well written and it's still engaging stories. And just because it has
absolutely
typically adolescent protagonists, I don't think excludes people from enjoying it. I think the idea that adults should
Absolutely.
like YA is quite silly myself.
Tell that to all the Harry
Love
Potter
it.
heads.
There we go.
Like that's like most of that's YA.
Yeah, I should really read Harry Potter.
If not all of it.
So I can actually
Yeah, I'd argue all of it. Yeah.
understand what you guys are talking about. Phoenix, what about you? What have you been up to?
I've been reading a book on witchcraft in Southern Europe, which is where I live at the moment. Yeah, it's really, really cool. So
You're
it's
in
talking about
Spain?
the old religion. Yeah, Barcelona specifically. And so yeah, it focuses on Italy because I don't know, it's just so wild to see how the first religion and indigenous people that the church took over was its own country, was the Roman church taking influence from the old religion and things like that, the indigenous practices of Italy and stuff like that. And, it's the development, the growth of what we now think of as witchcraft was formed alongside the growth of the Catholic Church. So it's this weird dynamic. It's really cool. But anyway, beside that, I won't go too deep into that. We've been reading that, as well as I just finished. It was an act of love. I made myself watch all of Adventure Time because it was something I loved growing up, and I really I wanted to get to the end, even though there was a lot I didn't like. I finished that literally today. I'm also playing Baldur's Gate with a friend a little bit. And I just picked up World of Warcraft again after many, many years.
Help you.
It's something no, it's cool. It's something my brother and I share. Like our relationship was forged over World of Warcraft. So it's a way we catch up. Like I put on a call and we talk and we play World of Warcraft, and it's really lovely actually.
That's nice.
Yeah. Hardcore mode. So if we die, we die. I have to make a new character.
Oh wow.
You can die together.
Yeah, that's intense.
I'm sorry, that game is just that game is just I don't want to say ruined, but I just cannot hear that name without imagining Eric Cartman. Like it's just they're inherently connected in my brain.
Less said about that, the better. Also, high fantasy. So maybe you can work World of Warcraft in, because I would argue that's one of the biggest high fantasy IPs, worlds, titles in the world. Not at the level of Tolkien, but probably not too far off, to be honest. So myself, I just finished, and I don't mean finished reading, I mean put down and stopped reading a book by Salman Rushdie, Salman Rushdie, you guys have probably heard of him. He's a very unfortunately controversial author of Midnight's Children and the Satanic Verses, which has a very controversial history I won't get into. I've really been looking forward to reading his stuff for a while. I couldn't find any of his big titles, so instead I picked up his most recent book, Victory City. I was really looking forward to this, not least because all the reviews were glowing. Like, they raved about it. Didn't enjoy it. It's sort of written in almost like a fairy tale style. It's sort of retelling. It's like a mythologizing of this medieval Indian city and people and culture. Sounds right up my wheelhouse, but I found the prose strange. I found the characters unrelatable and flat, and I feel crazy because everyone but me thinks this book is a masterpiece. So I don't know. Anyway, I put it down. I stopped reading it, sadly. I started skimming, and then
Happens.
yeah, it does. Ladies and gents, before we jump into the episode topic proper, before we jump into the episode topic proper, we have a contact form in the episode notes down in the description, and we would love to know if there are any top shelf high fantasy novels that we've missed in our conversation going forward that you think we should know about, or any interesting points about high fantasy that you would love to discuss, and we'd be very happy to bring them up in the next episode, or discuss them one-on-one, or to make it part of the show in some way. We want to hear from you. Raise up your voices. So, high fantasy, ladies and gentlemen, high fantasy. What is high fantasy, first of all? Probably always best to start with the description. Have you guys ever heard the term epic fantasy as a subgenre name?
Yeah, that rings a bell.
I haven't, actually.
I'm with Phoenix.
I'm seeing lots of people online say that high fantasy is also epic fantasy. I'm seeing lots of people say that there's a sharp demarcation, and not having an English degree and the history of writing essays on high fantasy, I'm not qualified to answer that. So I'm going to say that epic fantasy and high fantasy are maybe the same thing. Well, what do both of them have in common? Well, high fantasy is defined by the epic nature of its setting, or by the epic stature of its characters, themes, or plot. It's set in an alternate, fictional world, which is not our own world, and this world is usually internally consistent, but its rules differ from that of our own world, i.e. Earth. Okay, so we'll drill down at that a little bit. But obviously, the name high fantasy implies that it is not low fantasy. Do you guys, if I say low fantasy, do you guys know what I'm talking about?
I can tell you what it looks like,
That's
but
good
I
enough.
don't know if I can.
That's
I
often,
can tell what it smells like.
That's often the only way I
Exactly.
think we can know a genre.
But I don't know if I can, make a table with it. But basically, as far as I get it, low fantasy is a world that is either our world or very similar to our world. Urban fantasy, you have elements of the unbelievable leaking into a setting that is similar to ours. Almost like Diagon Alley in Harry Potter. I mean, it is London, but it isn't. Or Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. You got London below. But high fantasy is like this completely different place. It might look like medieval Europe, but it definitely isn't. It's inspired by our world, but it's definitely not. That's kind of how I see it.
Well said.
In my mind, I see literary fiction and high fantasy as opposite ends on the same spectrum. And between those two, you have you have literary fiction being like purely our world. It's fiction that takes place in a replica of our world. You dial it up a little bit, and you arrive at magic realism, and then you dial it up a little bit more, and you arrive at low fantasy or urban fantasy. And then you keep going, and then until you arrive at high fantasy. That's how it works in my mind.
I don't think that's far off.
That's an interesting spectrum, Phoenix. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
I couldn't really speak to low fantasy versus high fantasy, to be honest.
I think you might be the least inclined toward reading fantasy of all of us here, right, Alex?
That's probably true, and I can tell you why, but I'll wait until.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we're going to touch on maybe the things that we don't love about high fantasy. I mean, I do like it.
I mean, even saying that the shots aren't fired is kind of shots fired.
No, this is a me thing. It's very much not a genre thing. It's about me.
It's nothing if not subjective. I've also seen low fantasy called intrusion fantasy. Very strange title, but the idea is you've a world that feels very familiar or very non-magical, but then magical elements intrude. And it also just occurred to me now that the difference in magical realism and low fantasy might be whether or not people are aware that there's magic, or whether they know that flying their winged horse over Colombia is actually.
I knew you're going to involve Colombia in this.
Of course. So it's also set apart. High fantasy is also set apart from the sword and sorcery genre, or the sword and sorcery subgenre, which you can think of pretty much like high fantasy, but grittier, morally grayer, usually not as sweeping in its scope, and usually a lot more violent. Think Conan the Barbarian. So,
yes.
Yeah.
My man Conan.
If high fantasy had a massive testosterone injection. To drill down a little more, these are the elements that high fantasy usually has. Usually, because no genre is set in stone. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. So 1, a magical setting substantially different from our own real world. Can we all agree with that? Does that sound more or less like what high fantasy is?
Yep.
I'm going to make an argument later on for Star Wars being high fantasy. I think it is. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but I think it's just got technology in place of magic and the Force, which is magic. Number 2, a deep or seemingly deep invented history and or mythology. What about that? What do you guys?
Yeah.
Seems to me like Tolkien is very responsible for that. I mean, obviously we'll touch on Tolkien, but I think he might have been one of the first to do the full, I'm going to invent a full sweeping history, I'm going to invent a mythology and work that into my books.
Invent a language.
Yes.
I think Tolkien invented a mythology and then realized he should write a book for it. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He probably had that brewing in his head since he was an adolescent.
Yeah.
Number 3, character themes and or plot that tend to be epic in nature. So what do we mean when we say epic? We mean big. The plot is usually we're going to save the world from the Dark Lord. The themes are grand battles of good and evil, like biblical in scale. The characters, if not necessarily great or great at the beginning, because that's an interesting high fantasy point we'll touch on, include characters that are great. There is a really powerful wizard. There is the greatest swordsman in the world. There is the only person in the world that's ever ridden a dragon for like 2,000 years, what have you. What about that? Does that sound about right? The epic nature of the elements of high fantasy.
Yeah, for sure. That
Yeah.
definitely speaks to me in terms of an element of like, when you think of high fantasy, you think of big things. You think of big battles. You think of big, powerful forces beyond anyone's scope. You know, you just think of like, Sauron versus versus Gandalf. Not really, but but these big forces, these big players.
I skim read, I'll be honest, I skim read an interesting essay that talked about high fantasy being the child of Judeo-Christian religion. The central idea of good and evil is so rooted in Judeo-Christian religion. In high fantasy, you've always got like this force of evil or darkness, which stands in for like Satan and that dark side. And then you've got good, which stands in for like, the forces of Judaism or Christendom. Anyway, I won't go on, but I think that's interesting. I think it inherits a lot of that epic scale from those holy works. Before I disappear up my own ass, number 4, often, but not always, takes place in a setting whose technological and cultural aspects are modeled after Europe, somewhere between the Middle Ages to the Iron Age. Now, again, I know there's always exceptions to this. You don't think it usually does? Not usually?
I think it used to.
Okay. Well, you might have a better sense for modern high fantasy than me. All right.
Yeah, then I think the last 15 years you've seen plenty of other things.
Okay. I'm going to confess I don't read a lot of modern high fantasy. Not by choice. It's just there's infinite number of books. Okay. Well, what's an example?
We'll talk about those.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, we're going to examples?
No,
I'm ready to add. I came ready to advocate.
Let's leave it.
Your own example. Star Wars.
Okay.
I have the perfect test. I have the perfect way to test whether Star Wars is fantasy or not.
Okay.
Nice.
Ready?
Yes.
Alex, do you like Star Wars?
Yeah, I like classic Star Wars. It's fine.
No, it's not fantasy, man. Sorry.
Okay.
No. I'll go into Paddy there. I mean, look, I would classify that as space opera, but let's say that the only difference between space opera and not Final Fantasy, high fantasy, is like sci-fi elements versus medieval elements. So, like, I think there's a case to be made for that being let's say the coin flip of high fantasy.
Okay? I like that. It's high fantasy, but number 5, often, but not always. So again, none of these are firm rules. Features non-human quote-unquote races, such as elves, dwarves, orcs, etc., etc., etc. I mean, this to me feels unequivocal.
It's a canon.
Not all high fantasy has it, but they're typically going to have people with weird ears, right?
That's true.
Yeah, the furries got their start.
Yeah, exactly. And final point, it will typically feature fantastic beasts and where to find them, such as dragons, griffins, giant sentient octopuses, and whatever. I mean, this, I think, is just as staple as the last one. What is a high fantasy story without a good mythic beast invented by the author or
Without a
otherwise?
giant sentient octopus. What is this book? I
I
want to read
was-
that.
I was
I'm into
hoping you were
that.
going to say octopus. I was mildly
Yes.
disappointed.
It's always octopuses that are sentient. Look, I made that up. I'm not aware of any fantasy
It's
works. of
octopuses
giant
all the way
sentient
down.
octopuses, but they should.
Oh, okay. Sorry, not to derail you. What about the Discworld series? Do they count as high fantasy?
Do they?
The Discworld series. Do
Of
they
course
count as high
they
fantasy?
count as
Oh.
fantasy. What do you mean?
High fantasy
High fantasy, though?
specifically.
Yeah, just because they're
Yeah.
funny doesn't mean they're not fantasy.
Yeah, I'd count
Okay.
it as high fantasy.
I would
Yeah,
argue
humor is
that
not.
they're definitely playing with all of the tropes of high fantasy. It's if high fantasy
Yeah.
didn't exist, Discworld didn't exist.
It's a bit like satire, though.
Yes, I don't know that they follow the plot and thematic elements of high fantasy, but it's got all the
Mm.
trappings. It's wearing high fantasy costume, but it's coming out as
Yeah, it's doing
As-
high fantasy drag.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
If you did have someone that was looking for a high fantasy novel, like they want to be swept away on an epic adventure, like that sort of flavor, I don't know that you would recommend that series.
I think you're right, actually. If you look at it from that perspective of like, yeah, someone's got he's jonesing for some Lord of the Ring kind of stuff, and you give him guards, maybe he's like feeling a little blue balled. But yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, no one's coming to Rincewind for like the greatest hero of all time. You know?
Matan, I'm just surprised to hear you say blue ball of all people in the podcast. I'm surprised to hear potting
I'm
mouth thing,
sorry.
man.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry.
Okay, well, that could be an interesting place to segue then into the plot and structural elements of high fantasy, because obviously we've described all the trappings there and all the clothes that high fantasy wears. I'm just going to do a dump from Wikipedia. I'm paraphrasing, so it's not a total
Dump it.
Not plagiarism.
No, I don't think it's plagiarism. Anyway, the AI doesn't know what I'm saying just yet. Many high fantasy stories are told from the viewpoint of our main hero. Okay, well, Discworld checks that. Often, much of the plot revolves around their heritage or mysterious nature, along with a world-threatening problem. Does Discworld do that? Kind of. I don't think the problems are often world-threatening. I think they're often much more mundane.
They're
Yeah.
city threatening, you know.
Yeah.
There are issues. There are dragons.
But
you know,
I
it's
think the
not-
scope is
they're not-
deliberately hilariously small
not-
often.
Yeah, but they're not
Yeah.
catching stray dogs. Okay, they're come on, guys.
Okay, it's
Stop
true.
with the slander.
It's not this is not slander. Anyway, in many novels, the hero is an orphan or unusual sibling. I have no idea what Wikipedia means by unusual sibling.
Unusual sibling.
And frequently portrayed with an extraordinary talent for magic or combat. And I'm going to add, even though that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily manifest at the beginning of the story. I don't know what unusual sibling is. I can't think of any examples.
Yeah,
Well,
no.
I disagree.
that would be a podcast idea: unusual siblings and where to find them.
Yeah,
So, I don't know.
I kind of love that.
Phoenix, what do you disagree with there?
Just the unusual sibling thing feels just far too specific for it to be. I know they're not. I don't think they're not saying that that's a staple of all high fantasy, are they? Or
I think
that's just like a.
No.
It's typical.
It doesn't specify.
Because you-
This is what they have,
I mean-
according to Wikipedia. I mean, I'd say things that it often has, but I don't know what it
Yeah.
means.
I mean, I would instead, I guess, distill that down a little bit more to just say that usually maybe the main character is a bit of an oddball, a bit of an underdog. Like usually it has maybe that element, and that's kind of the weird element. As well as I love Lord of the Rings as a counterexample to the usually has special magical powers or abilities, because Frodo's pretty useless to the end
Very
unless
true.
unless you do say he has
I-
an especially powerful heart or whatever. He has that resilience to the
Well, Matan, I see with your hand up. 1 second, though. We're going to touch later on why Frodo's innocence in the high fantasy kind of structure might actually be a power of his. And it's an interesting point that I want to discuss with you guys. But you're right. He doesn't have power in combat. He doesn't have power in magic, and he never gains them. Yes. Matan.
Hi.
You have it.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that Phoenix, I love that you brought it up. I love that you brought up Frodo, because he's such a special protagonist. And if you look at Lord of the Rings, you know, a lot of high fantasy does the sin of wish fulfillment, of basically creating a character that is crafted to make you feel like that's you, and you insert yourself into that world, and you're getting the letter to go to Hogwarts and that stuff, and you're riding the dragon. Lord of the Rings doesn't really do that. Lord of the Rings, maybe it's because of the amount of the size of the cast and how different they are from each other.
You don't think Lord of the Rings does that?
I don't think anyone wants to be Frodo or Sam going to Mordor. You know, I don't think anyone's dreaming about
Like Gandalf, though.
He gets thrown off a mountain by a fire demon. I don't think anyone's having a good time.
But he comes back like in an evolved form.
Okay, so let's. Tolkien was a conservative middle-class man in Edwardian England who probably liked his second breakfasts and liked staying indoors and didn't want to leave the Shire. He
loved Elevenses.
He was called up to fight in World War One, right? I think even if we don't feel like we're Frodo, the intention of the author was certainly to write a character who we immediately relate with. I mean, I think Frodo is a big part of himself. I can relate with Frodo.
I agree with
absolutely.
that.
You guys don't?
I agree with that part. I want to clarify. I think that a lot of the characters are very, very relatable. My point is that, like, I don't feel like he wrote that fantasizing about this, like, almost VR isekai experience that we sometimes see from fantasy books. We're like, oh, you're the chosen one, you're gonna save the world. And
you said wish fulfillment earlier. It's not wish fulfillment.
Not at all. I don't find it to be wish fulfillment.
There's no Mary Sue's in it, you know.
Exactly what Alex said.
Let's define Mary Sue. Who's got a good definition for that?
Just a character that's good at everything. Sorry, Patrick Rothfuss, I know you're on our side, but Quote is a Mary Sue. Okay, Quote is good at everything he does. Quote from the Name of the Wind. Yes.
There's actually a lot of disillusionment in the sense that it's like you have this image, like Patrick Rothfuss sets you up with an image of Quoth as being a prodigy, but then he actually actively undermines himself as saying, like, for his entrance exam to the school, he was like, I did very well on that exam, full on cheated, but I was doing what I needed to do to make sure I got in. But it's not this image of just like, oh, like he touches it and it turns to gold, which is what we all secretly want, is just to be this prodigy.
And he's a fallen Mary Sue, because when we see him in the story, not really a spoiler, he's in a state of having fallen from grace.
But he also had a scene where he's playing the lute so beautifully that everybody burst into tears.
Yes. No, I think he was at one point.
Let's be fair.
He's a Mary Sue.
I'll give you 2/3 Mary Sue. I'll give you a scrappy Mary Sue.
It's a character who's good at everything with no seeming flaws, and they come up every now and again. Don't know where the term Mary Sue came from. Anyway, moving on. So even though they often have a great talent for combat or magic or gain it over time, they usually begin the story young. If not as an actual child, then portrayed as being very weak and or useless. Does this resonate with us for our understanding of high fantasy? We're talking about the protagonist too? Yeah, I think so. And that's just typical story arc stuff, right? In order to become great, it only really resonates if they begin at the opposite of greatness. Yeah.
I think that this is why there's such a big automatic like glom on with video games as well, because there's this progression where you start really weak and you get stronger and stronger until you're just this tanky machine. Like, and I think that falls into the wish fulfillment element as well, because I do think the wish fulfillment thing is a big part of couple of you know, some high fantasy. I probably can't speak to as much as you guys, but I think there's a really good tie in there, which is maybe why people have been like, we can like World of Warcraft and all the myriad, League of Legends, all the myriad sort of high fantasy based games.
I like the term hyper fantasy. It's got elements of everything thrown in, and it's sort of fantastic, but it's just taken from every direction of culture. There is a wonderful and deeply strange series of books. I don't remember what the series is called, but the first one is called Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. So strange. It's definitely medieval fantasy, but only because the Earth has gone through so many cycles of rising and falling that the leftover technology is basically magic. It's not really a spoiler. For example, there's this desert of sparkling sand, and if you get really close, every grain has a different color. They call it polychrome, and it's oceans of ancient discarded plastic ground down from all the old
Whoa.
civilizations.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
and that's all
That's
it's
cool.
plastic. Shadow of the Torture is a
Cool.
trip, man. It's so strange. Anyway, so what was the last point? Begin young.
Building power, starting.
Thank
beginning,
you. Yeah. However, they mature rapidly, experience a considerable gain in fighting or problem-solving abilities along the way. I mean, we just touched on this. Yeah, that's what they do. They grow in power. Final point from Wikipedia. Big props to Wikipedia for this. The progress of the story leads to the characters learning the nature of the unknown forces against them, often a being of great power and malevolence. The villains in such story are usually completely evil and unrelatable. What do we think?
I agree, but I also think that probably less and less true as we're going by. I think there are some modern fantasy books coming out that they take part of these points that you mentioned, and
then would they be
have more
high
freedom.
Fantasy, or are they
I
then
think
straying into
so.
different genres? Okay, interesting.
Just the natural evolution of it, even Tolkien, when we think of his villains in terms of absolute evil, even Tolkien, when you look at characters like Sauron or Gollum, even he had a lot of grays splattered between the whites and black.
Agreed. Although I think there is an ultimate evil in a lot of these things that is unreasonably evil. I mean,
above.
Yeah. Sauron is irredeemably. We talked about this in the villains episode as well. The idea of like elemental evil, quote unquote.
But even beyond Sauron, like his world implicitly has an elemental evil. It's like it just exists. There is darkness in the world, and it breeds darkness.
Yeah, evil as its own thing. Again, kind of like the whole the devil being, the force of evil in certain religions.
I do agree with Matan though that like this does feel like a definition of high fantasy to me, but it feels like a very specific flavor of high fantasy, specifically a flavor that does feel a bit antiquated at this time. Like we are kind of evolving, and I guess like if someone were to set out to write a high fantasy book, I feel like if you wanted to appeal to the modern audience, it wouldn't be beneficial to you to adopt a lot of those qualities, and chances are those wouldn't be the I don't know. So like it's just the things that interest us are a bit more, because we do like feedback off of each other, and so that feels like an older definition that since then we have subverted it so many times, where we want something a bit more nuanced now. So we want that same structure, but we want it like just colored a bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
I can give a very, very short example of one of the most successful modern fantasies, and that's the Mistborn books by Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah, okay.
And the first book, The Final Empire, depicts this fight of this crew against an evil god. At first glance, you got another Sauron on your hands. He's an evil god, absolute evil.
God in quotation marks, kind of, right?
No, literally God. He's literally God. He's got godlike powers. He's the god of the world. And in the second book, spoilers alert, we get his background, what he was like before he was an evil god. He was a man, that bad things happened to him. So even that trope of the absolute evil, now we kind of look behind the curtain and we get to see more, that maybe if Sauron was written today, you would get an episode explaining Sauron before he was corrupted.
Well, the IP is owned by Disney, so look out.
Yeah.
Is Mistborn high fantasy?
I would definitely say it's high fantasy. It's got its own world. It's got a character that starts with no powers and becomes almost the most not almost. She does become the most powerful magician fighter in the universe.
Yep. Magic is
good
very
and
common.
evil. Completely different world. Races. You got everything.
Fair. Yeah, no, and that's a perfectly good point. And it's interesting to see how the genre does change. Like I agree, it is still high fantasy if some of these elements change over time. Perhaps the genre itself is just changing. Or perhaps we need to call it post-high fantasy, because adding post to the beginning of a term is usually a good idea when we don't know how to categorize it. So moving on, we can't talk about high fantasy without talking about Tolkien, right? Because Tolkien was the first high fantasy author, right? No, Tolkien was not the first high fantasy author.
But
I'm glad.
Jump scare.
Sorry, listeners. I thought he was.
Say yes.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom has always told me that Tolkien was the first, that he started high fantasy, but apparently he's not. again, when Tolkien was writing, the term high fantasy didn't even exist. From what I've read online, it was coined in an essay, I don't have the name, in 1971, quite a bit later than Tolkien, right? So anything we call high fantasy is necessarily retroactively looking back and applying a label to works that the authors might not have applied themselves. Tolkien called his work, where is it? Heroic romance. Heroic romance? From memory, that's the term he used.
That's nice.
Yeah, I agree with it. I feel it.
I think it fits well enough.
Get it. I like that.
But there were authors before Tolkien who were writing stories that hit all of the beats we just talked about. And it's hard to say which is the first, but a lot of people seem to think that an author called William Morris, interestingly, a British author, because I think high fantasy did largely come out of Britain. Don't know why, but that's fun. He wrote he wrote many works which could now be regarded as high fantasy, but one, The Well at the World's End, is often regarded as sort of like the archetypal work of William Morris. The Well at the World's End is the tale of young Ralph, the youngest son of King Peter of Upmeads, the good King Peter. Bored of provincial life, Ralph sets out to explore the world, journeying to such locations as the Wood Perilous. What a wonderful name. Meeting characters such as the sexually appealing Lady of Abundance and the evil Lord Gandalf. Go ahead, Matan.
Hold on, what? I was going to be surprised by the Lady of Abundance, and then you just said Lord, Gandalf?
Yes, Lord Gandalf, with an O, Gandalf, with a swift white horse whose name is Silverfax.
Shut up.
What? Silverfax owned by Gandalf.
Get out of here.
Yes.
No.
This is almost as big as Ali revealing the third Nolan.
Yeah. This is
wild.
This is effective. I mean, this is shaking my reality more than Ali's reveal about the Nolan brothers.
Gandalf was an evil king or an evil lord. I don't think it has any relation to Gandalf.
Somebody wrote this retroactively. Somebody must have wrote this retroactively.
I think it's more of a homage.
This has been retconned.
Stealing.
This just proves time travel is real. That's all it does, okay?
That's true. Yeah. I agree with you, Matan.
We think
found them.
The Lord of the Rings is the foundational stone, but it's interesting to see that earlier works had this really big influence on Tolkien, and not just things like Beowulf. Actual works of quote-unquote high fantasy were influencing the guy. And William Morris is writing some 40 years before Tolkien. So aren't they fun facts?
Fun silver facts.
Okay, this has got me asking questions now to myself around, or I feel like
everything is a lie.
Everything's a lie. No, but I wonder the case with Silverfax and Shadowfax. Now I'm wondering if I wonder if fax is if there's some etymology thing there that is just very applicable to horses, and it makes sense for Tolkien to be even if he read that work, to be well, I would also like to use fax with my horse because
Phoenix,
it's epic.
He's called Gandalf.
Yeah,
that one I can't.
I think that ship has sailed, man.
I can't. Yeah.
It's okay.
I can't.
Kind.
We're allowed to reference. I think that's fine. I think a little.
It's okay.
Sometimes is a good thing.
It's an homage. Clearly, it sounds like Tolkien had a really a significant influence and love for this work. So it's not surprising to me that he would reference it. And I don't even think it's bad. It's kind of just a bit of a wink and a nod, being like, "Hey, see what I did there?"
Yeah.
The Gandalf thing is a lot though. That's a lot.
No, he changed one letter.
But I mean, think about how many people use the name Fenrir for some wolf character they have, and it's that's Norse mythology. It's a bit further back, but it's that name's used so much.
And at this point, Tolkien kind of is our mythology. I mean, obviously not in a literal sense, but if we can draw from these works that are omnipresent. I mean, the number of works now that are set in a tribal, vaguely Middle Eastern, vaguely post-apocalyptic desert setting because of Dune. I do it with my core.
Vaguely desert.
Yeah.
I mean, it is funny though. Imagine calling someone like Fredo now, who has I mean, I guess if you recontextualized what their role was, you made that the Golem character, that might be interesting, which sounds but it would be a stretch to make a main character and call him Fredo.
I feel like the topic of this podcast just changed from high fantasy to an investigative, quest to find the truth behind whatever the hell was going on there.
The deep dive.
When was that one written?
Follow. That one was written in. I don't have the date written, but I've got a note that it was about 40 years before. And Tolkien was, I think, The Hobbit was published in something like 36. Lord of the Rings was published in something like 51. So 1890s, I'm gonna say 1910s.
Was it before he was born? Was it before he was it was published or before he was born?
Listeners, if you want to come in with the contact form and correct our ignorance, then please do.
Please correct our ignorance.
Please correct our ignorance.
Please correct our ignorance.
So, Tolkien didn't establish the high fantasy genre, depending how you define it, but by God has he been influential. I don't think you can have a fantasy work now that is not under his very, very long shadow. The list of elements that he, if not invented, then popularized, will include, but is not limited to, depictions of elves and dwarves of Norse mythology as quote-unquote races that live alongside quote-unquote men. And I love that it's the race of men. I always found that hilarious. Can you have a dwarven man? No, a man is a different thing. Sexist. Dwarves and elves disliking each other. I mean, that's very common in high fantasy now, especially the more stereotypical stuff. And that came from Tolkien, as far as I can make out. The world being doomed because of a dark lord. I don't think many or any high fantasies before him really used that, or if they did, it wasn't this common thing. And now a stand-in Saruman is absolutely standard high fantasy fare, right? Like, what's high fantasy without a good Dark Lord? And that a plucky band of good-hearted heroes must defeat the Dark Lord to save the world. Again,
must be plucky.
They must be plucky, yeah.
They need to be plucky.
Apply only if plucky.
Should have
exactly.
Should have a graph showing like the scale of pluckiness and how likely you are to save the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
For success.
Like an XY graph.
Yeah, they gotta have
that's the whole basis. That's the whole basis of Dungeons and Dragons is you get together a plucky little group and you go on your adventure.
Pluck them from whatever they were doing.
It is Dungeons and Dragons is well, we'll talk about that in a little upcoming thing, because yes, it's so very in the shadow of Tolkien. Having maps at the start of the book, I mean, that is huge now. Was he the first author to do it? Don't know. I'd be surprised, but I don't know. But he was the one that popularized that for high fantasy and fantasy in general.
I kind of want to, I love Tolkien. I've read his books many times, but I do want to push back a little bit, because I feel like if someone were to read Lord of the Rings and then set out to write a fantasy book, I think that would be a flaming failure, because there are so many steps that have been taken since, like Phoenix mentioned. I think it would be like trying to become a math professor without learning algebra. Like, you're skipping crucial steps in the development of the genre. And I think in the 70s and 60s, you did see a lot of Lord of the Ring knockoffs. I don't want to accuse anyone. I think Sword of Shannara was accused for being like a very close knockoff. You had the Wheel of Time, and I think that worked for 20, 30 years. But I think that high fantasy in its Tolkien-esque form, I think that's like, if you're a writer and you're listening to us, I think that it's very important that you read the stuff that's been coming out in the 10, 15, even 15 years starts to feel old. Really, 2010 and above, you just see how much the genre has changed. And led by none other than Patrick Rothfuss, really, with The Name of the Wind, that's kind of been showing what high fantasy can look like by creating this hybrid of high-low fantasy almost. So that's just the pushback.
I agree. He's so resonant now that maybe to copy him does seem too familiar. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if there's, sounds a little gross sometimes to think about markets, but we do need to consider it, a market for things that are very traditionally high fantasy. You know, the formula works. People like the formula. Having said that, though, I agree. I mean, we should probably mix it up if we can, right? There's one more point which I have to this list of like big things that Tolkien, if not invented, then popularized, and that is as the central MacGuffin being some kind of piece of magical jewelry or magical
Definitely.
accessory, a sword, something like that. Do one of you guys want to give a definition for what a MacGuffin is?
This is actually the first time I'm hearing this word.
No.
Really? It's
Mhm.
Surely not,
it's-
Phoenix.
MacGuffin. Get the MacGuffin. The thing that everybody wants,
Mm.
Mhm.
but nobody needs exactly. They want it because
They
I'll
might
give an
need
example.
it. They might need it.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
the
no.
ring.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off in
Go
terms
ahead.
of
Let you
the,
finish.
like, the strict definition of it. A MacGuffin is an item that moves the plot forward.
There we
That's
go.
really all it is. It doesn't have any
Mm.
practical value to people within the story. They can't use it,
It
but
might.
it moves the plot forward.
They can't use it. I mean, they can
Uh-huh.
use the Ring of Power.
Okay, that's
mean-
that's fair. You can you can physically put on the ring.
Okay.
so yeah, that's fair.
Like, but you can't really, because what use does it really? Like,
It
has
turns you
this
into a
big
shriveled monster that
abstract-
eats fish heads.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
what are you
cursed.
talking
Yeah,
about?
it's a
super
cursed thing.
useful.
Yeah. Only
Um,
very like Gandalf could use it. Like
Could
only
he?
very, very powerful beings could actually
Like,
use it.
Gandalf couldn't use it because remember the first scene where he's like, "No, don't give it to me."
He didn't want it
Like,
because
yes.
he could use it.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean because it would have corrupted him, right? Isn't that the point? Like,
It would have
I'm just
corrupted
going-
him, but he, like, for example, if he put it on, it wouldn't have turned him invisible. He would have actually worn it, and he would have actually been able to siphon its power like Sauron could.
Oh wow.
Oh, I
It
didn't
only-
know
What a
that.
boss.
That's cool.
Yeah. It
Could
only turns people
Gandalf
in.
do that?
Could Gandalf do what?
Could Gandalf siphon the powers of the ring? I'm just asking.
I you know what? I'm gonna go out
We're
on a
getting
limb
into
and
the
say he
weeds now.
couldn't.
Hashtag Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
Folks.
yeah.
Let's
Yeah, yeah.
Another
The train
Phoenix
goes on the
is
rails.
actually in the weeds.
I'm going to guide the train out of the forest and onto the
Thank
rails.
you, Paddy. I saw red there for a second. I don't know what happened then.
Need to correct the outrage. And from Tolkien, more or less, was born Dungeons and Dragons. Even if people don't know what it is, they'll have heard the term before. A lot of people will think it's a video game. It's not a video game. The fantasy role-playing tabletop game, where players take on the role of wizards, warriors, elves, dwarfs, and etc., and delve into dungeons, slay dragons, and speak in silly voices while rolling dice. I know I just called you guys up for Into the Weeds, but fun fact, did you know that in the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, you could play a warrior, a wizard, or an elf, or a dwarf? You could be a wizard or an elf. There was no such thing as an elven wizard or a dwarven fae.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Yeah. Mind blown.
Because wizards are inherently elven.
Yes, and elves are
Mhm.
just inherently elf.
No, no.
So I'm going to argue that without Dungeons and Dragons, the game, which I think was invented in the 70s, around then, high fantasy would not have proliferated nearly so widely into video games and therefore into popular culture in general. The whole idea of leveling up, which now has gone from video games to a common, like people will say, oh, I've really leveled up in my skills. They might not even know that's a video game thing. That comes from Dungeons and Dragons. As far as I'm aware, and listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, Dungeons and Dragons is the first thing to do that. And video games took that, as well as the idea of hit points, for example, hit and miss, as whether you do damage. Dungeons and Dragons started a lot. There are a lot of influential nerds, and it helped that a lot of them were math nerds. So they went into coding. Alex, you talked before about how video games really simulate that power curve in high fantasy world, starting as like kind of like a level 0 mook, but then eventually becoming the High Lord of such and such to save the world. Yeah, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, again, arguably started that in game form. You start level 1, a very meek warrior, wizard, whatever, and eventually you get to, well, maybe get to the esteemed level 20, where you can take on massive dragons and demigods and whatnot.
Yeah, and I'd say probably JRPGs, Japanese RPG role-playing games, Japanese role-playing games as a video game concept really took that and ran with it.
Yes.
And that has helped sort of permeate into the greater culture as well. Like, you know, things like, I can't remember what it's called. Is it Dragon Quest? I listened to a whole podcast.
I mean, that sounds about right.
Too early in the morning. But yeah, there's a bunch of them that would take this D&D concept, and you'd have a party, and it would basically be an algorithmized Dungeons and Dragons game, and you do this big quest around the map. But I think that had a big influence as well, and that eventually came to the West also.
Yeah, absolutely. We love our JRPGs, even if we don't know that we love them. Like even if we've not specifically played one. all in all, because of these cultural influences and high fantasy coming at us from all directions, arguably high fantasy is, if not bigger than it's ever been, then a massive thing in culture. I mean, even if the following aren't necessarily high fantasy, they certainly bear the trappings of high fantasy. Game of Thrones, The Witcher, Star Wars. I'm going to keep flogging this dead horse.
Yeah.
Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think it ticks a lot of the high fantasy boxes.
Oh,
The main one it doesn't tick is the Eastern influence. That's like the main thing.
The Western influence.
The Eastern
No, the Eastern
influence.
Okay, it has it.
In term-
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, but that I don't think high fantasy has to.
Yeah,
have that.
but-
Well, okay, and that would actually be its magic system is actually founded on the chakra system, and a system that is actually known in our world. That's another thing that would distinguish it, I would say.
But
you could argue
by
that
the
the
way-
magic of like Gandalf and things comes from the Western conception of magic, right? Spell books and grimoires and alchemy with potions.
Yeah. To
Yeah.
circle it back, it's rooted in witchcraft and stuff like that, and how the church changed it.
But that's my point, because I think that fantasy, especially the stuff coming out right now, it's not. I think we need to separate high fantasy from European fantasy or European-based fantasy, because you got stories coming out like Ember in the Ashes, which is like a combination of Roman based fantasy. It's got more Roman elements, but also a lot of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern elements like genies and that kind of stuff. And people are just going wild with it, and really I think it's beautiful. Like, just because we've seen a lot of knights in shining armor slaying dragons. How about we see I don't know, a Roman in a shining armor? Yeah, or samurai.
Yeah. Absolutely. These genre twists are what make it fresh and interesting, I think. And I haven't seen a lot of that myself personally, but it makes perfect sense. I hadn't heard of the sort of had Wuxia. Is that it? Wuxia. It's Chinese. I think it's martial arts fantasy. I read some people say it is high fantasy, some people say it isn't. But yeah, I mean, nothing to do with European Middle Ages. It's all monks and Chinese martial arts and mysticism, and definitely has roots in the real world, but is often fictional setting, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, Wuxia, fun to look up. We're coming into a close now, but the wonderful website tvtropes.com, which I love this site. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. It's so
good,
clever and witty and true. Anyway, it gave a very interesting point about the nature of the protagonist's victory in high fantasy. I touched on this at the beginning of the show, so I want to elaborate a little bit. So I'm just going to quote straight up from TV Tropes. Okay, so in high fantasy, the protagonist often wins by the following, and I want to see what you guys think about this. Victory is not achieved through force of arms, the main feature distinguishing high fantasy from heroic fantasy. It is also not achieved through wide-ranging strategy, logistics, and political and military conflicts, which is generally the case in low fantasy. Essentially, if Aragorn had killed Sauron in hand-to-hand combat, that would have been heroic fantasy, and if Gondor had beaten Mordor by having more allies, better strategy, innovative tactics, and a better trained army, that would have been low fantasy. Instead, in high fantasy, victory is achieved through the efforts of a small number of characters acting against great odds, and a supporting leader or a reluctant hero will achieve it instead of the, say, rough-hewn barbarian of Conan the Barbarian or Beowulf. So I think they're trying to say that the ultimate victory is not achieved by overwhelming force or combat. What do you guys think of that as a high fantasy thing?
To me, that almost just kind of feels like an evolution of the genre. Like it would be, like that, what you just described would be the subversion of what maybe some of the fantasy that came before it would be.
I said
which is when high fantasy would be invented.
The Frodo's power is almost that he isn't a warrior or a wizard, that he's innocent. Ultimately, he saves the day by throwing the ring into Mordor. The only way he can throw it in is by being the humble and innocent one. The fact that he is small, that he doesn't seek power.
I'm with you, but change it to Sam. Please just change it to Sam. Change it to Sam.
Oh, well, okay, sure.
Frodo takes the ring, goes wild with it. He says, screw this, I'm going to be the Dark Hobbit Lord.
Sam
saves the day.
Okay, but point still stands. That's no. What? So, any other thoughts?
I
on this
agree with
idea?
what you said. I agree. I see it. I definitely see it.
In Star Wars, the Emperor is slain by his own Darth Vader. Ultimately, the villain underling, through the power of love for his son, throws the Emperor into a pit. Luke Skywalker doesn't defeat the Emperor through a lightsaber battle. He defeats him through the power of like family and love and familial bond.
Friendship.
Yeah, because Star Wars is high fantasy. I'm going to keep saying it.
Yeah,
Any other thoughts on that particular point? Because it's an interesting one, and I can see it being contentious. Do we have any other examples of high fantasy works where that's the case or not the case?
I'm now honestly just curious if that is genuinely a staple of high fantasy, or if it just so happened that high fantasy as a genre was invented at this stage in our subversion of the genre. And that's kind of what I'm wondering.
I have no answers.
And then the question to that is the subversion of what genre then? Are we just talking about fantasy in general?
Of just, I guess fantasy in general, or that sort of trope against like, I don't know, the idea of, medieval armies and those sorts of things were written about before, but maybe the idea of what was interesting was more just like head-to-head combat and that sort of thing, and the solution was just gain allies, build up your army, blah 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 blah, and then as we continued to explore the genre, it was, well, we want to see the underdog who slips through the lines and defeats it in an unconventional way. And maybe that's where we arrived. I don't know,
which is almost now a trope unto itself. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I feel
now
like
we're
if
subverting
Disney
that.
did a high fantasy thing, it would very much be like the hero would win through the power of love and friendship. Like, it almost feels like a cliche now.
Yeah, I think it's still very powerful.
Yeah,
Actually,
you couldn't, because that would undermine their character.
Yes,
like that's one thing I've always noticed. Like in with protagonists, and I find it really frustrating in a way. Like, you can't. Like, even if the villain deserves to die,
the villain kills
they
himself.
need to die either by their own hand or some horrible accident. It's like Goku, like
very convenient. No, let's very pile on Goku. Why not?
Yeah, he's like, no, Frieza, we could have made it go on for another 40 episodes. Anyway, that's
yes, they could.
Put that out.
Yeah,
I really agree with Alex. I feel like it's almost the Disney cop out of like, the villain's gonna die, but the hero's not gonna be responsible. It's the villain who's gonna push too far and slip and fall off the tower. And it's like the way to eliminate the villain without having blood on the hands of the hero, which is kind of cheap, Like, I mean, if you're gonna get the character,
take some responsibility,
you push her down the tower. She made your life miserable, Rapunzel.
At the same time, I don't know that I'm ever bored of seeing it, and I think I quite like it. When I see it, I think I feel, I don't know, sometimes I don't want the main character to be tarnished. I want them to stay pure. But, I'm a pacifist at heart. The last thing I want to do with you guys is ask you if there are any high fantasy works you're engaging at the moment or recently that you find really interesting or different or subversive or just really cool, like examples of the genre as is. But before I do, are there any other points you want to throw in or touch on or talk about before we come to that closing section?
Just a tiny, really short point. Really, really short. I think Alex gave me that advice many years ago. Alex, maybe I'm just giving you credit for no reason, but I think you told me that you write the kind of books you want to read. And I think that just write the books you want to read. Don't worry. Do worry about market audience. Okay, that's important. But don't worry too much about, is it high fantasy or low fantasy or sci-fi, or is it actually horror? Just write, follow the writing advice that you get, but don't bother yourself that much with where it sits.
Agreed. Yeah.
The interesting material is to be found in the margins, I think. The blending of ideas and genres and things, that's where the newest, most interesting things will happen. So don't catch yourself up too much on, is this strict high fantasy? Is that even a thing? I think we've probably argued ourselves here that it's maybe not. It's a little more blurred than it initially appears. So
Oh no, I'm arguing that it is a thing. But look at that. But that's the nature of the contentiousness, right? There will be no consensus about this. If anyone out there thinks like, no, high fantasy is not a thing, this is silly, then yeah, I totally accept that. However, I do think that there are definite examples of the genre you can point to, like Star Wars. Okay, so moving on. we've all read at least some high fantasy. And what are some examples of works that we're reading, we have read, or we've read in the past that you think really resonate with you, or are doing cool things with it, or whatever? Alex, I believe you have an interesting example that you're playing right now.
I do, yes. I am playing through Elden Ring from
Mm.
FromSoft. And that
Elden
is
Ring.
a very excellent example of
Ring.
high fantasy. I think I think it follows all the tropes that we've looked at so far. There's there's a pantheon of gods and goddesses.
There's a deep
There's
history
magic.
and mysticism.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's a very, very intricately built world, and because of the nature of video games, such that you can kind of wander around and talk to anyone you want, you can delve as deeply or as shallowly into it as you want. You can discover everyone's stories. You can go around and kill these random what are they, the Undying or something, just like weird little dead guys that travel. I think there's some guy in a boat.
Oh,
who's,
they
like, meant to be
can't
the,
die.
like,
It's like they've taken the opposite of Dark Souls. It's like, but
yeah,
what if they never
exactly.
die? Yeah.
Yeah.
Semantics.
There's a bunch of interesting stuff there. There's lore out the wazoo. Yes, it's just very interesting. And I think the fact that you're able to actually play it makes it a little more palatable for me, as opposed to just reading through it. I don't know why.
Because you're not big into high fantasy, are you?
I am not big into high fantasy in general.
Why?
Even the good stuff that I've read, like The Name of the Wind. I'm not saying that it's not a good book. I do think it's a good book. It's just not for me.
No, totally reasonable.
And
can you?
I think one of the things that annoys me about fantasy in general is how grand and sweeping it is. I like conflicts to be very small and interpersonal. That's what I can relate to personally. Not saying that it's not that I'm not saying that it's a bad thing inherently. It's just not relatable to me. And I think that's maybe the crux of why I don't like it. Look, there's probably examples that prove the rule that are the opposite to that, where I'm like, yeah, this is great. It's huge and sweeping. But that seems to be the crux of the matter for why it doesn't really resonate with me as much.
We didn't really touch on this, but yeah, by necessity, if a story is big and epic, quote unquote, in its scope, then it won't give as much time to the small interpersonal details usually, because it can't. There's only so many words on a page. So yeah, I think that's a fair criticism, and that is something that high fantasy typically doesn't have as much of. What about you, Phoenix? What's like a great work of high fantasy that's resonated with you, or something you're reading at the moment?
The recent work, so like obviously I could say Lord of the Rings. I love that book. But the recent fantasy that I don't know if I would count this as high fantasy, but it's just more modern fantasy that I thought was just done very, very well, very engaging. I love The Lies of Locke Lamora. Arguably not it. I'd say it's medium fantasy. I don't know. It's like the high sweeping grand adventure, but dialed back just a little bit. The scale's a little bit smaller, more focus on interpersonal relationships, I guess. But very well done. Jade City by Fonda Lee. That one's excellent. Again, arguably not high fantasy. And it was a cool example as we've been talking about this, because in my mind, I was like, I was thinking about Jade City, and I was like, it has a lot of staples that high fantasy has. It's a made-up world, made-up magic system, all this stuff. And I was just trying to think of like, why doesn't it feel like high fantasy to me? And apart from it being very modern, it's in a modern world. It's not European based. The combat system's not it's more Eastern based. It just has some flavors that aren't, and it's smaller in scale as well. It's not it's a gang war as opposed to a war, the war of good and evil, but very excellent. If you like high fantasy, chances are you'll like both of those books.
It sounds like even if it's not high fantasy, it has a lot of the elements of high fantasy, like high fantasy, but
yeah.
Matan, what about yourself? Are you reading anything at the moment that's high fantasy?
No, but I wanted to support Phoenix on Lies of Locke Lamora. I think, Alex, that might be something you would enjoy. It's kind of a hybrid, low fantasy, low personal stakes, but definitely in a fantasy world with their own magic and their own settings. I want to shout out the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. I hope I'm saying the name right. Very unique fantasy. All the powers are related to earthquakes. They're very severe. She does very cool things with point of view, which just shows that even in genre you can get fun and experimental. You don't have to stick to it. And
sorry to interrupt, but like I'm interested in that. Can you think of an example of like what it does with point of view? It's often hard to articulate, but
I don't want to ruin because there's some really cool twists.
Okay.
But
I think I will read this one too, so don't.
She's got distinct point of views that are very satisfyingly presented and connected. That's all I'll say.
Interesting.
And a more traditional one is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. It's more of a YA. It follows the usual beats, from zero to hero. Very, very nice guy. One of the nicest protagonists I've seen, and very likable. And great imagination. Everything feels fresh and new. The world doesn't feel like a rehash of elves and dwarves. She does everything. To me, it felt very fresh and unique and creative. So I recommend that too.
Very nice. The movie that I've watched more than any other in my life was Willow. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Dude, look, I haven't seen it. No, I'm
not saying it's bad, but
because as a kid, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It probably gave me my love of fantasy. It's stock high fantasy. I think it's a wonderful film. If you haven't seen it and you want some just heartwarming high fantasy, watch it. And it's got some cool battle scenes. And no, I won't give a spoiler at the end, but let's just say it leans into certain
I haven't seen it, so I'll watch it.
Beautiful film. Don't know if it holds up. But as a book and as an adult work, I'm going to say Shadow of the Torturer by Jane Wolfe. And if you like those works, read the others. That's the one I mentioned before. Deeply strange. There is so much interesting lore in this book. It's almost like a lore dump with a story threaded through it, but I'm all for it. Only thing is the male gaze is very, very prominent.
Hey, if we can put up with it with Stephen King,
I didn't know. Yeah. I didn't know Stephen King. I haven't read much King.
Oh yeah.
Oh, it's a whole discourse.
It comes and goes.
Yeah, it does come and go. I think he wrote Carrie. Like that's like I feel like that's pretty ahead of its time, really.
Yeah, but Jane Wolfe, Shadow of the Torturer, wonderful, very strange high fantasy. Well, guys, thank you for joining me. I think we've touched on all the major points and not seeing anything left in my notes list. And we've concluded that it's definitely, maybe, possibly, maybe not an actual subgenre that people can point to. So well done, gang. Well done.
Yay.
Matan, do you want to close us out with a quote?
Sure. This one is by Lloyd Alexander. And he says this. He says, fantasy is hardly an escape from reality. It's a way of understanding it.
Beautiful. I think that's true, and I think that's kind of profound. We can think about fantasy, especially high fantasy, as almost the modern mythology. Ancient peoples had their Epic of Gilgamesh and their tales of Beowulf. We don't have that anymore. We can look back to the ones of the past, but often they seem quite distant and remote. So we invent them ourselves. We use high fantasy as a way of creating mythologies, just like we do with Marvel superheroes. And I think that's okay. And I think it does reflect the values and aspirations and hopes and dreams of our current age. So guys, thank you very much for sticking around. We've been Precipice Fiction. If you would like to leave a review, a comment, or perhaps give us some feedback down in the little doobie-doop below, we would love to have all of the above. It's the only way we really get seen. And reach out. Tell us what you think. Tell us that you love us. Tell us that you hate us. Give us any feedback you want. If you want to check out some of our work, we've got an anthology out called The New Mythic. It contains short stories by all of us. It's a hell of a read, available on Amazon. And yeah, we've been Precipice Fiction. Until next time, enjoy some fantasy, high or low. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye. See ya.
Did you guys have the show about the bear and the moon? And it says goodbye to the moon?
Is that like Blue's Clues?
Yeah, something blue. A bear says goodbye to the moon.
Bear in the Big Blue House? Bear in the Big Blue House, right?
Yeah. It felt Western. I used to wave like hell. I would wave until my mom would carry me away. Like, that bad.
I should have kept that in the recording.
You're listening to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.